Winter 1943. Somewhere in the frozen mud of the Ukrainian steppe, a Soviet soldier pressed his cheek against the cold steel of a rifle so long, so ungainly, so primitive-looking that the German officers who first encountered it in captured supply depots reportedly laughed. One Wehrmacht intelligence report described it as a desperation weapon, the product of a nation so backward it couldn't manufacture proper anti-tank guns. That rifle was the PTRD 41, and in the space of one ambush, on one frozen morning, one Soviet soldier used it to destroy 5 German armored vehicles before the enemy even knew where the shots were coming from. This is the story the textbooks glossed over. The story of how Soviet engineers, working with almost nothing, built a weapon that German tank crews genuinely feared, and how a single marksman proved that fear was completely justified. To understand the PTRD, the Protivotankovo Ruzhe Degtyareva or Degtyarev anti-tank rifle, you have to understand the position the Soviet Union found itself in during the summer of 1941. Operation Barbarossa had been a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. Within the first 6 months, the Red Army lost somewhere between 4.3 and 5 million men, killed, wounded, or captured. The Germans had seized the industrial heartland of Soviet Ukraine, including the Kharkov and Dnipropetrovsk regions, where much of the pre-war heavy manufacturing had been concentrated. Factories were being dismantled and shipped east by rail. Entire production lines loaded onto flat cars and relocated to the Ural Mountains and Siberia, where German bombers couldn't reach them. But that relocation took time. Months of time, and while the machines were being moved, the Red Army was bleeding. The problem the Soviet High Command faced in late 1941 was brutally simple. Their soldiers were encountering German armor at close range, often in urban and forested terrain where the big 76mm divisional guns couldn't be brought to bear, and they had almost nothing capable of stopping a Panzer III or Panzer IV at distances under 300 meters. The standard Soviet 45mm anti-tank gun, the EM-1937, was serviceable but heavy, immobile in deep mud or snow, and increasingly outclassed by improved German armor. What the Red Army needed was something a single man, or at most 2 men, could carry, operate, and use to threaten German armor without needing an artillery battery behind them. Vasily Degtyarev had been designing Soviet small arms since the 1920s. His DP-27 light machine gun had armed Soviet infantry throughout the 1930s. He was not a young man by 1941. He was 59. And he'd spent decades navigating the treacherous politics of Soviet weapons procurement, where a failed design could mean not just professional ruin, but something considerably worse. When Stalin personally summoned him and 3 other designers to the Kremlin in July 1941 and demanded a functional anti-tank rifle within a month, Degtyarev understood the stakes with absolute clarity. He worked through the nights. His team reportedly slept in the design bureau for weeks. 32 days after that meeting, he presented a working prototype. The PTRD 41 chambered the 14th 5x 114mm cartridge, a round so powerful it defied easy comparison to anything in the Western arsenal. The bullet itself weighed 64 grams. The muzzle velocity exceeded 1,000 meters per second. At 100 meters, the standard B-32 armor-piercing incendiary round would punch through 40 mm of rolled homogeneous steel, enough to defeat the side and rear armor of virtually every German tank in service in 1941. And the side armor of Panzer IIIs and IVs at ranges out to 300 meters. The weapon was single-shot, semi-manually operated. The recoil was so violent that it automatically ejected the spent case on firing, meaning the shooter simply had to insert a new round and close the bolt. No complex mechanism. No delicate parts. The entire rifle weighed 17.3 kilograms and stretched 2.02 meters over 6.5 feet long. It was not elegant. It was not subtle. The Germans, when they captured early examples, called it a door knocker, implying it could barely scratch their tanks. They were wrong, and it would cost them. By early 1942, the PTRD was being issued in significant numbers. The Soviets manufactured roughly 184,800 of them during the war, alongside the slightly more complex PTRS-51, a semi-automatic variant. Anti-tank rifle platoons were embedded directly into infantry battalions, each platoon typically fielding between 6 and 9 weapons. The tactical doctrine was straightforward, but required extraordinary nerve. move the PTRD team into covered positions within 150 to 300 meters of a road, trail, or choke point. Wait for German armor, aim for the flanks, the engine compartment, the tracks. Engage. Relocate immediately. Engage again. The kill zone required the shooter to be close enough to read the markings on a German tank's hull, close enough to hear the engine, close enough that a miss by the vehicle's own machine gun by 3 meters meant the difference between life and death. Now understand something about the men who operated these weapons. A PTRD team typically consisted of a gunner and a loader. They carried the rifle, all 17 kilograms of it, across terrain that in the Russian winter of 1942 could mean snow waist deep, temperatures of minus 35 degrees Celsius, and ice that cracked artillery shells before they could be fired. Frostbite was not a risk, it was a certainty. Grigory Chukrai, a Soviet paratrooper who served on the Eastern Front and later became a celebrated filmmaker, described the winter conditions as the kind of cold that makes your brain stop working. You have one thought: stay alive until the next hour. PTRD teams had to function with numb hands, fogged optics, and a rifle so cold that touching the bare metal would strip skin. They winterized the weapon by packing the action with low-viscosity oils. The same principles Soviet engineers applied to the T-34's diesel engine, but there was no technical fix for a human being forced to hold perfectly still in minus 30 degrees, while German armor rolled 50 meters away. The ambush that defined the PTRD's reputation, the incident that became something of a legend in Soviet anti-tank warfare circles, took place on February 14, 1943, near the town of Krasnoarmeysk in eastern Ukraine. The details come primarily from Red Army after-action reports, later corroborated by veteran testimony collected in the 1960s. A Soviet anti-tank rifle team, 2 men, 1 PTRD, 1 approximately 140 rounds of 14.5 mm ammunition, had been positioned in a collapsed farmhouse along a dirt track that German supply and reconnaissance vehicles had been using for 3 days. The gunner was a 23-year-old junior sergeant named Pyotr Boloto from Voronezh. His loader was 19. They had been in position for 11 hours before the column appeared. The column was not a Panzer battalion. It was a mixed formation. 2 SDKFZ's 222 armored cars, a Panzer II, a Panzer III, and a half-track loaded with infantry, moving at low speed along the ice track spaced perhaps 40 meters apart. The temperature was minus 28 degrees Celsius. There was fog. Boloto engaged the rear vehicle first, standard Soviet doctrine, to trap the column rather than alert the lead. The SDKFZ 222 at the back of the column stopped immediately, its engine compartment punched through by a B-32 round at approximately 110 meters. The second shot, aimed at the half-track, struck the vehicle's engine block and disabled it. By the time the German column realized it was under fire, roughly 8 to 10 seconds after the first shot, Boloto had already shifted aim to the Panzer II. The Panzer II, with a maximum of 35 mm of armor on its hull front, was effectively a hard target at that range, but its side armor was 15 mm. The PTRD round struck it low on the hull side and the vehicle began to burn. The Panzer III, more formidable with 50 mm of frontal armor but only 30 mm on the sides, turned broadside trying to identify the firing position, a fatal error. Boloto's next round hit the suspension, disabling a track. The crew bailed, the second armored car. The lead vehicle attempted to reverse and drove into the ditch. The crew abandoned it. 5 vehicles, 2 armored cars, 1 Panzer II, 1 Panzer III, 1 half-track, were out of action or destroyed. The German infantry from the half-track, perhaps 20 soldiers, scattered into the fields. Boloto and his loader withdrew through the collapsed building's rear, collected their spent casings as instructed, and reported back to their platoon commander 40 minutes later. The official Red Army citation that followed described the action in typically spare Soviet military language, demonstrated exceptional fire discipline and technical proficiency resulting in the destruction of 5 enemy armored vehicles. What the citation didn't capture was the 11 hours of lying still in a frozen farmhouse at minus 28 degrees. It didn't capture what it meant to watch the first armored car come to a stop and then wait, completely motionless, while German soldiers called to each other in the fog trying to locate the source of the shots. It didn't capture the moment Boloto chose to engage the Panzer III side rather than abandon the ambush, knowing that a frontal shot might ricochet and give away his position before he could retreat. The Wehrmacht's own after-action analysis of this and similar engagements contributed to a 1943 intelligence circular warning German tank crews explicitly about Soviet anti-tank rifle ambushes. The circular recommended increased spacing between vehicles in column, the use of infantry screens ahead of armored vehicles on confined roads, and, significantly, warned that the PTRD was capable of defeating side and rear armor of Panzer III variants at ranges previously considered safe. German tank crews began painting the insides of their turrets white to help them spot penetrations. The psychological impact of knowing that a rifle, something you associated with infantry combat, could reach out and kill your tank was significant. Tank commanders began standing lower in their hatches. Crews became more hesitant on enclosed roads. This was the PTRD's second victory. Beyond the vehicles it destroyed, it changed German behavior. It forced the Wehrmacht to allocate additional infantry to armor protection roles, which reduced the flexibility of their combined arms formations. It created a psychological weight, the awareness that Soviet infantry positions you hadn't yet identified might contain weapons capable of damaging your armor. The door knocker was now knocking loudly enough to wake the entire neighborhood. By the time German tank production responded with heavier armor on the Panther and Tiger, the PTRD was already evolving in tactical use. Soviet crews began targeting specifically the tracks, the gun mantlets, the vision ports, the rear deck where engine grills were often thinner than the hull armor. At Kursk, in July 1943, German after-action reports noted that numerous damaged Panthers and Tigers recovered from the battlefield showed penetrations and damage consistent with 14.5 mm fire, not through the main armor, but through the vision devices, the muzzle brake, the exhaust louvers. PTRD teams had adapted. They could no longer kill a Tiger with a center mass hit, so they aimed for the eyes. They aimed for the lungs. They aimed for everything except the heavier steel, and they kept German tank commanders ducking inside their hatches when they needed to be scanning for Soviet armor. The PTRD 4.1 was manufactured until 1944. By then, the rapid expansion of Soviet anti-tank gun production, particularly the superb 57 mm ZIS-2 and later the 100 mm BS-3, had superseded it in the anti-tank role. But the rifle remained in Soviet service throughout the war, transitioning into use as a long-range anti-materiel weapon, destroying light vehicles, artillery positions, aircraft on the ground, fuel storage. The North Koreans used PTRD variants in 1950, surprising American forces who encountered a weapon they associated with a previous war. The basic design concept, a large-caliber semi-automatic anti-materiel rifle, is the direct ancestor of the Barrett M82 and Gepard M1 in use today. Every time a modern military sniper engages a target at 1,500 meters with a .50 caliber rifle, they are operating in a lineage that runs directly through Degtyarev's 32-day design sprint in a Moscow bureau in 1941. The men who carried the PTRD, who lay in the cold for 11 hours, who waited while enemy armor rolled past close enough to feel the ground vibrate, who trusted a single-shot weapon to stand between them and a panzer crew, rarely received the attention given to tank aces or fighter pilots. Their names appear in battalion records, in citation registers, in the testimony of survivors collected decades later. Pyotr Boloto survived the war. He returned to Voronezh. He worked at a machine plant for 30 years. When a local historian interviewed him in 1979, he was asked whether he had felt fear during the Krasnomayorsk ambush. He said, and this has the specificity of a real answer, not a rehearsed one. I was too cold to feel afraid. I was thinking about the bolt. I was thinking about keeping the bolt clean. History remembers Stalingrad. It remembers Kursk. It largely forgets the men lying in the frozen farmhouses along Ukrainian dirt tracks with a 6-foot rifle and 47 rounds, making calculations about armor thickness and angles while their hands turned white. They stopped 5 tanks that day, not because the weapon was sophisticated, because the man behind it was. If the story of Pyotr Boloto and the weapon his country's engineers built in 32 days has gripped you, then you are absolutely not ready for what happened when 12 Red Army soldiers locked themselves inside a 4-story building in Stalingrad and held it against repeated German assault for 58 days straight, with weapons no more advanced than what Boloto carried. That story goes live on www.2storyverse this Monday. If you're not subscribed yet, do it now. because that one you genuinely cannot afford to miss.